Good afternoon, and welcome to a webinar on regulatory challenges of new infant formula submissions, hosted by EAS Consulting Group and presented by EAS Independent Advisor for Food and Color Additive Safety, Dr. Robert Martin, Independent Consultants, Dr. Robert Burns and Dr. Timothy Mork, and Senior Director for Food Consulting Services, Alan Saylor. EAS specializes in FDA regulatory matters, with a prime focus of assisting domestic and foreign food, pharmaceutical, dietary supplement, medical device, tobacco, and cosmetics firms comply with applicable laws and regulations. EAS is staffed with former FDA compliance and inspection officials and industry executives and is assisted by an extensive network of consultants with many years of FDA and industry experience. Today's presenters are Dr. Robert Martin, who is a former Deputy Director for FDA's Division of Biotechnology and GRAS Notice Review, Dr. Robert or Robbie Burns, who was a former Global Nutrition and Scientific Affairs Director for Cadbury Schweppes and the former Director of Nutrition, Science, and Policy for Mead Johnson Nutritionals, Dr. Timothy Mork, who is a former Vice President of Scientific and Regulatory Affairs for Nestle, and Alan Saylor, who has a long career history in food safety, including time at the International Dairy Food Association, USDA, and FDA. As a reminder, during the webinar, you may ask any questions of our panelists by typing them into the questions box. And with that, I'll say thank you again for joining EAS, and I'll turn the presentation over to Dr. Mork.
Thank you, Amy. EAS is really pleased to have you join us in this webinar today. As Amy said, we have a large team of independent consultants with extensive experience, but we thought it would be helpful, since we've had many questions asked recently about infant formula and what it takes to bring a new infant formula. A fairly brief overview, as relatively speaking, but due to the complexity, the multiple dimensions, and the regulations surrounding the infant formula, we'd like to kind of outline the challenges and pitfalls of launching a new formula. So as an overview and outline today, I'll be giving a brief background to the Infant Formula Act. Will be followed by Dr. Martin, who will talk about the compositional issues of infant formula. And then Dr. Burns will touch on the types of studies required to ensure appropriate protein quality, growth, stability of the formulas for infant use. And then Alan Saylor will end up with our extensive manufacturing requirements, the quality systems, the record keeping, all of the manufacturing protocols that need to be followed. We know that there will be a lot of questions. We'll open it up for a Q&A at the end, but now I'd like to just start off with just a brief background of where the Infant Formula Act has begun. Back in 1980, the Congress passed the Infant Formula Act, which was an amendment to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and that was to specifically introduce regulatory control over formulation and production of infant formula. Over the ensuing few decades, FDA has issued implementing regulations consistent with the statutory requirements and made amendments appropriate as the science has evolved and as new aspects of manufacturing have come into play. Finally, in 2014, we had a final rule issued that really brought everything up to date, especially with good manufacturing practices, quality fact, procedures, notification, and record keeping. Now, I'd like to just go into the next slide to give you a baseline definition. Infant formula really, first and foremost, is a food. It's represented for special dietary use solely as food for infants because of its simulation of human milk or its suitability as a complete or partial substitute for human milk. And in this context, the infant is from 0 to 12 months of age. As a food, the FDA jurisdiction falls under the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, with program responsibility in the Office of Nutritional Products, Labeling, and Dietary Supplements, and ingredient and packaging responsibility in the Office of Food Additive Safety. And the next slide, okay, so we're going to be focusing primarily on new infant formula, and this is defined as a formula that's manufactured by a person that has previously not manufactured infant formula in the past, or if there has been prior manufacturing, there's been a major change in either the processing or the formulation. And some of the examples of a major change that would make this, that would qualify for this, are a new manufacturing plant, a new production line, new technologies or change in packaging, and any alteration in the macronutrient or substantial changes in macronutrient composition, or maybe some new ingredients that are added. So if any of these changes have been made to an existing formula, this process needs to be followed. Now, there are examples of exempt infant formula, specifically when infants that have inborn errors of metabolism, low birth weight, or otherwise medical or dietary problems that fall outside the normal population. And these are special cases that allow, and there are regulations that allow for special labeling and requirements and specifications. They're different from the typical manufacturing of infant formula. We note that exists, but today our focus will be primarily on new infant formula for the normal infant population. Now, the process in the next slide really begins with a registration, a submission process, and a verification. And this is all laid out in guidance documents. There's a considerable detail online and in the FDA website, but I'd like to just hit the highlights of what these three areas entail. The registration is primarily giving notice of intent that a company would like to bring a new formula to the U.S. marketplace. Basic information, the name of the formula, the manufacturer, and place of business, but also each establishment at which manufacturing is expected to take place needs to be detailed in this registration document. It's sent to the address shown on this slide, basically the College Park address of the infant formula medical food staff for their evaluation. Now that's the first step, but then the submission is much more detailed, and this is something that needs to be sent 90 days, at least 90 days before market introduction. And in this case, again, the product name and description, now in terms of the physical form, whether it's a liquid, a powder, or a concentrate, explanation of why it is a new infant formula, quantitative formulation of the infant formula in considerable detail with each ingredient listed for, and this is a change, a detailed description of any reformulation to the formula or the processing. And then finally, there are certain assurances that need to be in writing that the infant formula will not be marketed unless it meets certain quality factors. Dr. Burns will talk about what that means in terms of the physical growth studies and the biological protein quality, and Dr. Martin will touch on the nutrient requirement aspect of this. Assurances are given also in writing that the processing of the formula complies with all the sections listed here, specifically in the manufacturing that Ellen Sailors will touch on at the end of our talk. Now, FDA would prefer that this new infant formula submission and the registration be submitted together for the efficiency of their process. Now, I'd like to add one more step, and this is after first production of the formula and before introduction into commerce. Again, there's a verification that the manufacturer sends in writing to the FDA that it, in fact, complies with all the requirements, is not adulterated. It's linking back the product name, filing date, and identification number that shows that this is the same as the one that was sent in the registration document and the submission document. And the fact it's overstated again that there has been no change to what was submitted, and now this product that has been manufactured actually adheres to the same standards that were assured in the previous document. To verify that, a summary of test results is included. These are test results done on the final product before it's in the marketplace, demonstrating that it meets all required standards. It's a written certification that the manufacturer has established all of the good manufacturing practices, quality control procedures, and in-process controls required, testing, etc., to prevent any adulteration of this formula. Now, I'd like to now turn the floor over to our expert in infant formula compositional issues, Dr. Robert Martin.
Thank you, Tim. And I'm going to be talking about the ingredients used in infant formula. The next slide will show you that. In the infant formula, the ingredients added to infant formulas can easily be divided into three categories. First, we have the required ingredients, new added ingredients, which are optional, and then food contact substance ingredients, which relate to the packaging of that's used in infant formulas. Next slide shows us now that typically any ingredient that is added to food, with very, very rare exceptions, must be approved by one of the following, either by way of a food additive petition, as a GRAS notice. GRAS notices can be GRAS determinations, and that could be either by way of a GRAS notice to FDA or an independent GRAS determination. But for the purposes of infant formula, the only one that we can use is the GRAS notice approach. Color additive petitions, very few color additives are added to infant formulas. Food contact notifications, prior sanctioned substances, or new dietary ingredient notifications. The ones that's important to us here would be food additive petitions, GRAS notice, and food contact notifications. For the required ingredients, there are 29 ingredients or nutrients that are actually required in infant formulas, and is cited by the regulation at 107.100. All of those ingredients must meet the specifications listed in those regulations, must be verified to be safe for use in infant formula, and documented by way of either a GRAS notice, a food additive regulation, or prior history in use in infant formula. The required ingredients that are specified by the regulations to be added to infant formulas are the ones listed here in this slide. And you will notice here they have all essentially recognized as nutrients. And basically what we have here listed are the units of measurement. Some required ingredients list, all the required ingredients rather list a minimum level. And you will notice that some required ingredients also list a maximum level, which determines the safety to which one can use those particular ingredients. Again, the amounts that you add to those products must indeed be documented. Again, this is a continuation of the required ingredients in this particular slide here. The next slide actually speaks to the new added ingredients or the optional ingredients. And these ingredients are typically added to the infant formula to mimic the ingredients and the functionality of those ingredients that have been identified in mother's breast milk. They all must be safe and lawful for use in infant formula, and for all practical purposes, they must be either GRAS or food additive regulation. The same amount of data is required for either, except that GRAS data is published. FDA has issued a number of guidance documents on what is required for these approvals. So therefore, rather than go through a lot of detail on what is actually required, I would refer you to this slide here where FDA discusses the essential requirements to get approvals for either GRAS notices or food additive petitions. And lastly, the next slide, I think, shows the requirements for food packaging requirements. And in 2016, FDA issued a draft guidance document to industry to talk about their concerns associated with the types of food packaging and so forth that is actually used to package infant formulas. And these food contact substances include not just the infant formula package that contains the formula itself, but also it speaks to baby bottles, bottle nipples, and baby bottle inserts and so forth. The best way to think about the requirements that originated because of this is to think about BPA, and the regulation here, food contact notifications, tells us exactly what types of information would be required to get approval for the use of novel or new food contact substances for use in infant formula. And now we'll turn it over to Dr. Robert Burns, who will talk about the requirements for certain studies.
Okay, thank you, Bob. This is really a discussion on the quality factors for infant formulas that are defined in the regulation, Part 106.96. There are essentially two. One is protein quality testing, and this is has to be by a bioassay, and it's usually a protein efficiency ratio test using a valid modification of the official analytical chemist method, the AOAC method. A little bit of history here is that this method was determined, infant formula regulations date from the early 80s. Amino acid analysis was not as sophisticated as it is today, and the sense of FDA was that the only good way to measure protein quality was through a bioassay. But it's calculated as the growth in grams of a rat per gram protein consumed when fed a limiting protein diet, 10% protein. That's lower than protein. It doesn't meet optimal growth of the rats, so the protein is a limiting factor for their growth over a 4-week period. These products should be the product that's tested in a PER study should be produced at the intended commercial facility using intended processes. This is a little bit of a tricky issue for some companies that are new to the industry, and may have a facility that produces this product that is scalable to final production. But again, that needs to be discussed with FDA if you're using anything other than the intended commercial facility. It's highly desirable to use a contractor with prior experience, and part of the reason for this is that it's these are not as simple to do. These studies are not as simple as they may appear, and there are federal regulations on the conduct of preclinical studies, good laboratory practices, and it's important that you've got somebody who's familiar with those regulations, both the and acceptable to have their facility inspected by FDA and meet all the animal husbandry and quality assurance aspects that are outlined in the regulation. Diet formulation is particularly critical for infant formulas because the AOAC method materials that have higher protein content than infant formulas have, so you do need to do some valid modifications of the method. I'll discuss some of those in detail in the next slides. Okay. Sorry, thanks, Amy. Protein for infant formulas have relatively low protein, about 11%, which is not much higher than the level that's specified in the AOAC method, 10%. So you don't have a lot of latitude to add other ingredients, and the infant formula provides the majority of the nutrients needed in the rats. Which creates a problem in that formulas are designed to meet the needs of growing infants, not weanling rats. Thus, PER diets must be formulated to meet the requirements of rats, and more importantly, to assure that there are no nutrient differences between the test and control diet that could invalidate the results. It's very important that you don't prejudice the study, if you like, in favor of the infant formula. And I didn't mention, but the control diet is typically ANRC casein, or a casein as a relatively high quality reproducible protein. First issue is that we need to think about is lactose. Milk-based formulas contain relatively high amounts of lactose, and that when weaned, rats quickly lose their ability to digest lactose. There's lactose in rat milk, but in a lot of facilities, the rats, as they get close to weaning, will be already consuming some of the chow that's available for the dam, and will lose their ability to digest lactose. Acclimating the newly weaned animals to a diet that has lactose levels similar to experimental diets. Otherwise, you're going to have a major weight loss whenever animals would be transitioned from a regular chow or regular diet to a high lactose diet. And you need to assure that the lactose levels are the same in the casein control as they are in the test diets. And occasionally you can work with the breeder and animal procurement and selection to make sure that the animals haven't been adjusted for too long to a low lactose diet. Next, fat is another issue that's a little different in infant formula. Fat is about 50% of the calories for infant formulas, which means that it's about 30% weight for weight on the dry formula, and the AOAC method specifies 8% fat in the diet, and most rodent diets would have even less. So again, this is a modification that has to be done to the diet, and need to make sure that the fat level in your test and control diets are the same. You need to make sure that they can address it by acclimating the newly weaned animals to a diet to a high-fat diet as well, so that they have that metabolic adjustment during the pre-acclimation period, so that they can grow efficiently on the test diets. Some nutrients are going to be in formula test diets at levels below rat requirements. These can be added, preferably as premixes, to assure that the nutrients are evenly distributed throughout the diet. Some test formulas will have nutrients at levels above rat requirements, and so that this does not appear to prejudice in favor of the formula test diet, it's advisable to add nutrients to the control diet to match those in the test diet. This will assure that there is no advantage that's conferred to the rats by the higher nutrient levels. Second quality factor that is critical to test in new infant formulas is infant growth and development. You see this as, in a lot of documentations, a guidance from FDA, as the growth monitoring study. This is typically a 4-month or 112-day, 15 weeks in some documentation growth study in newborn term infants. Again, when you say newborn, the infants can't be fed right from birth, but they should be enrolled in the study before they are 14 days of age. Protein quality testing should be confirmed before this study. That is for several reasons: to make sure that the formulas have good protein quality, and to assure the institutional review board that there is no risk taken with the quality of the protein aspect of the formula. It should be produced in a commercial facility, and as with, even more importantly than for PER testing, it should be using the final process that you're planning to use. Ideally, the test formula is compared to a marketed formula in a double-blind randomized controlled trial. This may pose a problem for manufacturers who do not have a marketed product in the US. It's possible, and if there are other designs contemplated, it's important to discuss these with FDA prior to study initiation. Some critical aspects of these infant growth monitoring studies include IRB, or Institutional Review Board or Ethics Committee approval, informed consent, and rigorous protocol compliance is especially critical. Some study design considerations is performance. Need to decide whether you're going to compare performance to a marketed product, which is ideal. And even if you do compare it to a marketed product, you should still meet the CDC growth charts, which is here standard for infant growth. It's the same as the WHO that's listed on the slide. And occasionally, manufacturers may choose to have a human milk-fed group as a control group. This is fine, but it cannot be a surrogate because infants can't be randomized to either receive human milk or a test formula. So, as I said earlier, most standard is a randomized double-blind controlled trial, but open-label studies may be acceptable. But if that is being contemplated, it should be discussed and approved with FDA before doing the study. These are very expensive studies and take a considerable length of time, so it's important to have FDA by any deviation from a standard protocol. It's important to have FDA acceptance before contemplating this step. Most studies are multi-center studies in order to get the enrollment in a relatively fast period of time. I did mention the duration of the study. Typically, it's a 4-month feeding part of the study, but study enrollment can stretch into about 6 to 8 months, even in a multi-center study, and then with several months for data collection and analysis. It's important to know whether study formula is provided in liquid or powder form. Most US infants are provided with liquid formula, so there can be some compliance or enrollment delays in enrollment if a powder formula is being used. Also, powder formula, it's a little more difficult to collect the formula that hasn't been consumed. It's always advisable to use an experienced clinical research organization to do these studies, but even when you do use a clinical research organization, you as a sponsor of the study are still responsible for the conduct and the safety of infants being fed the formulas. Next slide. Protocol development is some aspects are worth pointing out here. It's important to specify flexibility around enrollment and at the monitoring. FDA have some regulation that specifies the number of monitorings that happen, and I've also got additional guidance on it. Adherence to randomization schedules is absolutely critical, and they should be specified in the protocol. Inclusion-exclusion criteria are important. For instance, if an infant is large for gestational age, is that still appropriate to be included in the study or not? So some inclusion criteria need to be defined up front. All relevant details around study compliance and informed consent need a statistical analysis of both the primary study outcomes and secondary study outcomes should be included in the protocol. These protocols require institutional review board or ethical approval before study initiation. It's critical to get the protocol as close as possible, or to get it right at the very beginning, because if protocol amendments are required, then they need to be developed and go back through the institutional review board approval again. So to get the study conducted in a timely manner, to get it right. Some aspects of monitoring and compliance that's critical. It's, again, this is the responsibility of the sponsor, is how is formula controlled at the study site. Do the sites have rooms, specifically locked rooms, that the study can be stored and allocated to the infants as they are enrolled in the study. Accuracy and completeness of the case report forms. Again, all this information can be audited and needs to be carefully monitored. Compliance with the randomization schedule. Again, this is critical that investigators not assign infants to studies outside of the randomization schedule, and adherence to the follow-up visits. And also, if there are any adverse events during the studies, it's important that they're followed up. The study report should address all deviations from the protocol and any approved amendments. It should include listing of the essential aspects of the growth study, which is length of infant's head circumference and nutrient intake, include all a priori and any relevant post hoc statistical analysis that are considered. And with that, I'll turn it over to Alan Saylor to talk about manufacturing requirements.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burns, and greetings to everybody. Good afternoon. I've got the pleasure of sharing a bit of information about the regulatory aspects, particularly related to quality of infant formula and production, and what is FDA expecting when in fact they come on site. So if we go to the next slide, you will see that the regulations, which are easily available, cover, and I've tried to highlight just those because my co-presenters have done an excellent job of presenting the details of formulation and running studies which are critical to being successful in the infant formula world, but the regulatory part is also very important. So one of the interesting things is the GMPs for infant formula were finalized in 2014, actually in the slightly latter half of 2014. If you look at the regulatory environment at that time, we had FSMA passed 2011. We had the initial preventive controls for human food published. We had the final in 2015. So as I go through this, if you're starting to kind of pinch yourself and say, boy, this sure feels like FSMA's preventive controls for any food manufacturer, yes, a lot of this is. There's also some things that are very unique. So let's go to the next slide. And here you can see that I'm going to talk mostly about the quality parts of this under subpart C. But these slides, and I'm going to be covering some of these slides quite quickly, will be available. So if there's something that you can add it by downloading it from the ES website. So one thing important to understand, quality factors versus quality. Quality factors we've been talking about, my co-presenters talked about quality factors related to the studies. Quality now, as I'm talking about, has to do with quality related to the production of the infant formula. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is what are the requirements to produce an infant formula? And so we'll cover some. I don't have time for all of the sections, but under 106, the regulation and FDA, when they come on site, they try to get to most infant formula processors once a year. They're looking for, do you have a written plan? And the takeaway from this slide is B, do you have a written plan that covers all areas of production? We'll go into more detail on the next slide as far as what that plan should be. Now, one of the things is training and education. There's a number of these areas, including record keeping, where you have to demonstrate to FDA, if asked, how is this individual that is keeping records or performing a key production responsibility, how are they qualified? Can you prove that they are trained? Can you prove that they are consistently performing at a level that is acceptable? After all, there is no forgiveness in the infant formula world. A mistake can be tragic. So FDA is very serious about making sure our production is meeting their criteria. And there's some examples here. I didn't put any in, but certainly like you'd expect, any production facility, the hygiene of the production worker in the infant formula plant has to be at a very high level. Next slide, please. Building. The building where the infant formula production occurs must meet very high levels of hygiene. Anything about hygienic zones, which is somewhat alluded to but not required in the preventive controls. Certainly in areas like Europe and probably some parts of the Asia, you will see that hygienic zones are required. There is no mention in the regulation, but certainly think about them. In the production and packaging facilities, the highest level of hygiene is required for infant formula. This also extends, as far as criteria in the GMPs, lighting, ventilation, and again, for the sake of brevity, I didn't include everything here. Let's go to the next slide. Certainly, the equipment must be made in a way and must be from materials that are not toxic, not corrosive, will not contribute some of their material into the infant formula flow stream. Certainly, the chemicals used must be EPA registered, and the labeling must be appropriate for their use. Lubricants must be safe. Food grade is preferred, of course. Instrumentation must be calibrated. And again, if you're saying, gee, this sounds just like preventive controls, it certainly is. We'll go to the next slide. As far as the ingredients, this is a bit of an interesting twist here. And I know that Dr. Martin may have alluded to it. It's worth repeating that if you have a substance that has a GRAS designation in the US for use in foods, but it is not specifically identifying use in infant formula, it cannot be used in infant formula unless it is found as acceptable for use in infant formula in the CFRs, or if it has a GRAS submission to FDA. A GRAS self-affirmation does not work in the infant formula world. It has to be a GRAS submission. So it is very important, and we have the infant formulation is completed, and then we are doing some studies, or the client is doing studies, and then we discover that, in fact, one of the ingredients we were not aware of because we were not asked to review it doesn't have any recognition in infant formula. It certainly has recognition in the food world. And so therefore, we have to work with the client to get GRAS a notification submitted to FDA. And of course, that sometimes slows the process of getting a new infant formula recognized. There must be written specifications, and certainly if there is defective material, you can either destroy it or you have to have a defective action plan. Next slide, please. So one of the important things is there must be a written master manufacturing order, and we'll have a slide at the end that talks in more detail about that. The idea is that you must have a written process in the way that you're going to make the infant formula, and if you find that through record keeping or observation you've deviated from this, then you must note that, and you must have a corrective action plan to address this. Next slide, please. The packaging is very important. If everything else is done properly and the packaging itself is not safe, then we have certainly caused a problem that is potentially detrimental to the infant. So therefore, FDA requires supporting information, certainly in new infant formula submissions. You have to put a lot of information about the packaging, the composition, if it's plastic, what are the plasticizers, are they acceptable, migration, use of inks, all of that. That's very important. And you must keep this information on file, even if it wasn't required to be submitted for review by FDA in case FDA wants to see it when they come on site. Next slide, please. See, in a few slides later, there are criteria where we sometimes have to hold the product. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we know there's a problem or FDA knows there's a problem. We have to hold it. And therefore, you have to have a quarantine system. And you may be one of the lucky few that never have to use it, but there must be a quarantine system, and you must have it written and be able to implement it if needed. Next slide. Finally, in general, there's a tremendous amount of attention, and my co-presenters mentioned this, about nutrient value. So many of the infant formula manufacturers use nutrient premixes they obtain from others. In a few cases, infant formula manufacturers make their own nutrient premix, but in most cases we don't. Regardless of whether you do or not, you have to demonstrate through record keeping, through analysis, that these nutrient premixes deliver the minimum nutritional requirements found in 21 CFR 117-100, and I think Dr. Martin had mentioned that. And in fact, whether you test all of the premixes or you have an indicator premix, that kind of gives you a sense that if that one is not at the right level, then there's something wrong with either the premix or the addition of the premix, and not enough premix got into it. So let's move to the next slide. Again, we had talked about the master manufacturing order. What is it? It captures all the significant production steps. I like the word aggregate. It's really a good word for steps in the case of this regulation. It has to identify all the inputs, the ingredients, anything that you'd use, including water, if indeed you're using water for some reason. and therefore it has to be complete. This is probably one of the first things that for, and it needs to reflect. So do you need to occasionally go out into the manufacturing facility and compare the master manufacturing order in writing against what's happening out in the production area? Absolutely. Slide, please. Now, records. This could be easily a 2-hour webinar by themselves when it comes to infant formula. So I'm just going to get the high points. You can go on to 21 CFR 106-100 and find the significant number of records. But suffice it to say that if you were making a food and you felt it important to have records of the production, the operation, the cleaning, temperatures, all those things, it's the same with infant formula, maybe just to an additional degree. Next slide, please. So with that very rapid introduction into the regulatory world operating an infant formula plant, what FDA might expect, and we didn't cover everything by any means, what about the reporting? What do we have to do if we are operating a plant? And as you know, we add new lines. We may change out an old piece of equipment with the new piece of equipment. We may, in fact, do a slight reformulation. When do we have to let FDA know about that? Well, when we have what's called a major change. If you are a intended manufacturer of infant formula, you've got to notify FDA. If you make a change in equipment, you need to notify FDA. If you bring in a new production line, you have to notify FDA. If you're making a label change, it's a good idea. It's no different than if we're manufacturing food. We can go to least cost formulations in the general food manufacturing world, and we don't have to notify anyone other than make sure our labels are correct. However, in the infant formula world, it is not like that. And finally, to wrap up, recalls are very important. Many times when we're doing recalls or market withdrawals in the general food world, we may notify FDA or the state regulator, we may not, and there are rules when you do and when you don't. In the infant formula world, if you have any deviation that might compromise infant formula that is in the marketplace, you have to notify FDA immediately. This is a food that doesn't necessarily have to be reported in the reportable food registry, because this has already been required prior to the reportable food registry that you have to notify FDA if something's going on. So Amy, I think I'll wrap up there. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you all so much. We have some questions coming in. So if you have questions out in the audience, please do feel free to email them or send them via the questions box. The first one, Alan, you just touched on, but if you could just reconfirm, for ingredients that are GRAS but have not yet been added to an infant formula, is there any separate approval process?
The GRAS process is the same for an infant formula ingredient or food additive as it would be for a normal food additive or normal food ingredient. The difference is if I have a GRAS notification or self-affirmation that is applicable to all foods, and I a food, but somebody else wants to use it in a bakery product that isn't really a snack food, it's a bit different, that GRAS notice could be applicable to both types of food. However, that GRAS notice, if I wanted to use that particular substance, which has now been recognized by FDA for general foods, I could not use it in infant formula because the GRAS notification to FDA did not mention infant formula and did not address that in its supporting documentation. So I would have to submit and build a new GRAS dossier and submit it to FDA for this same food additive, but because it's specific to infant formula. The process and the review is the same, but infant formula has to be specifically mentioned in the GRAS notice. Thank you.
Okay, the next question I think would be for Dr. Burns. Is there a minimum number of infants that must be enrolled in these infant growth and development studies?
If I could just add something to the previous comments that Alan made about GRAS, one of the differences between an ingredient being GRAS for a general population is that infants are a little different in the sense that they have high calorie intake relative to their body weight, and they're also fed a formula as the sole item of diet for a substantial period during their development. So exposure assessment becomes very critical to address in a GRAS dossier for infants. But coming back to the specific question, there is there is no specific requirements. It depends on your statistician will help you decide the number of infants that you need to enroll in the study based on your experience with the variabilities in infant growth and development. Typically, they are around 50 or more infants per group. That's 50 on the control group and 50 on the test group or more.
Do infant formula manufacturers need to confirm that processing aids and ingredients are used in the infant formula are allowed for that use?
And this is exactly, it's a great question, because this is exactly what some organizations don't answer that question before they go forward, because many of these substances are commonly used in food. So why would this be an issue in infant formula? And as Dr. Burns said so well when he added more clarity to my answer on the grass, is that this is a different population, and therefore you must do the due diligence. In fact, that's one of the things when we're working with clients that Dr. Martin does work on, is to make sure that all of the ingredients, whether they be food additives, processing aids, or just an ingredient that would be presumed, that they are acceptable under the U.S. regulatory system. Thank you.
How do you determine if ingredients are allowed for use in infant formula? There are many that state it in the GRAS notice or in the CFR, but many ingredients you see on labels of infant formulas have no documentation and regulations.
Some ingredients have been used historically in infant formulas, so for instance, taurine has been added to formulas. It was added to formulas before the Infant Formula Act, so that's been quote unquote grandfathered in.
So with that, I will say thank you all for joining us. Please email Alan. His email is on the screen if you have any follow-on questions. And we look forward to seeing you at a future webinar. Thank you.